Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. With this evening's program, we welcome Dr. Michele Gelfand. I'm Claire Noble, the Director of Programming for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. The Vail Symposium has been offering affordable, thought-provoking programming to the Vail community since 1971. Two items to be aware of before we get started. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for tonight's speaker. You can type those in there at any time. We'll get to those later in the program, and we'll get to as many questions as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. Thank you to all the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the Town of Vail, the Vail Daily, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Antlers at Vail. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Jeannie and Dale Mosier have underwritten the winter season. Kathy and Neil Kimmel have underwritten the Hot Topics series. The Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Donors at every level make our programming possible, and we want to thank them to making tonight's program and all of our programming possible. Our next program will take place on Tuesday, January 18th. We'll host a webinar with Dr. Daryl Bricker, the author of Empty Planet. He's the CEO of Public Affairs at Ipsos, the world's leading social and public opinion research firm. Malthus may have been wrong. The global population will begin to shrink this century, and in some countries, the decline is well underway. So join us to learn more about the implications of this demographic change. And as is the case with many of our speakers, our speaker tonight and our speaker next week are both published authors, and you can find their books at the Vail Public Library. Tonight's program focuses on the power of culture and cultural norms. Dr. Michele Gelfand is the John H. Scully Professor in Cross-Cultural Management and Professor of Organizational Behavior at Stanford Graduate School of Business. She's also Professor of Psychology, School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. She's the author of Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World. She's the past president of the International Association for Conflict Management. She holds a PhD in social and organizational psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I just want to remind our audience to please use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen to submit questions for tonight's speakers. Welcome, Dr. Gelfand, and I'm going to turn the program over to you. And when you're ready for those audience questions, just invite me back on.
Will do. Thank you so much, Claire. I'm just delighted to be here and to share with you some of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 decades. And I really wish that we could be in person, but I'm just still delighted that we can connect by Zoom. And I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm just going to start with a short story, actually about 2 fish. They're swimming along, and one fish says to the other, as they pass by another fish, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they look at each other, and one says to the other, "What the heck is water?" And this story, it makes a very simple but profound point, is that sometimes the most important realities around us are the things that we take for granted the most, the things that we don't really see. And for fish, that's water. But for humans, that's culture. And culture is this really strange puzzle because it's all around us all the time, but we really take it for granted. And we take for granted how much it's influencing our behavior from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep. And it's interesting because we humans have had many technological feats. We've put a man on the moon, we've wired the earth, we've discovered some of the laws of gravity. And as a cross-cultural psychologist, I would say that if we could understand the laws of culture, we might be in a better place to build a better world for all of us. And as a cross-cultural psychologist, today I'm going to talk about some of my work that I've done all around the world. Basically, I'll start with the idea that when you go and travel around the world, like many of you have, you probably see many contrasts. For example, if you go to Singapore, which is called the fine country, there's many rules that you have to abide by lest you are punished, including things like not flushing the toilet in public settings, or not bringing in large quantities of gum into the country, not picking flowers. Even walking naked in front of your curtains at night when they're open might land you a fine in Singapore. If you take a short trip over to New Zealand, you'll see very different types of behavior. You see, for example, people might be walking barefoot in banks. You might see kids lighting fires on college campuses like this. And New Zealand is the only country that I know that has its own national wizard. So this guy here was a retired, actually fired professor from Australia who landed in the streets of New Zealand. And he was lecturing on everything from rugby to religion. And instead of punishing the deviant, actually the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time asked him to become the Wizard of New Zealand. And his job was to entertain the country. And that he did. He would burst himself out of eggs on libraries, and he would entertain the country in many different ways. He just recently retired, I've heard. If you take a short trip also over to Europe, in Germany, you might see people waiting patiently on city streets, even when there's no cars around. In my own hometown from New York City, where I grew up, you'll see people jaywalking constantly, even with kids in tow. This device on the left side that you can see here is actually an interesting thing that they're developing in some parts of Germany. It's called street pong, and it's a computerized game of ping pong. And this guy here is playing ping pong with the person across the street. And actually, it's telling him when the light is about to change, and it's an extra incentive to stay put on the streets. A more serious contrast, you might notice that you can actually smoke weed in places like the Netherlands, but you might get the death penalty for the same behavior in Indonesia. And all of these different types of contrasts have something in common, and that is to say that they reflect underlying norms for behavior and how strictly groups abide by social norms. Social norms are these unwritten rules for behavior that sometimes get more formalized in terms of laws and codes. And they're really important because they help us to coordinate and predict each other's behavior on an unprecedented basis. In fact, if you can imagine a world without social norms, it's really, it would be a place that we would not want to live in. We would be in a context, for example, where people would drive on either side of the street, or they might be stealing food off of their people's plates in restaurants. Or imagine a place where sex is allowed anywhere, on the slopes, or in movie theaters. There's a reason why we don't actually do these things. That's because we've developed social norms and enforced them, and they really tend to be quite invisible. They're not something that we quite think about very often. And most importantly, they're really the glue that keeps human groups together. And what I've been studying over the years is that this glue can be stronger or weaker depending on the context, and with really important consequences. And this is something that I've been calling the distinction between tight groups and loose groups. Tight cultures have strong norms, strict punishments for deviant behavior that restrict the range of behaviors that are seen as permissible. Loose groups have a wider range of behavior that's seen as permissible. And there's, in this context, there's much more tolerance of deviance. This distinction actually was talked about many, many centuries ago by the Greek philosopher Herodotus, an historian, in his book, The Histories. He didn't use the words tight and loose, but in fact, he was contrasting tight groups like the Egyptians with other groups around the world that had looser norms. And this construct later was picked up, tight and loose, by anthropologists in the late 60s. And I started to study this in basically the late 1990s, because it kind of fell off the cultural map, this distinction. And what I want to talk about today with you is take you on a kind of journey to understand this distinction of tight and loose. And what I'm going to cover a bunch of different questions. First of all, I want to start at the most macro level of analysis and answer the question, do nations differ on the strength of social norms, or tight and loose? Can we measure this distinction? Is it distinct from other dimensions of culture? And most importantly, what explains this kind of variation? Why do some groups lean tight and why do other groups lean loose? And I also want to talk about the kinds of trade-offs that tight and loose confers to human groups. I want to then kind of go back into history and kind of explore whether or not this distinction can be found in non-industrial types of samples, not just in the modern era. And to this, I'll turn to some anthropological type of work, and I'll code ethnographies and tell you about what we've learned from working with anthropologists. And then I want to talk about this as really a fractal pattern. This comes from a metaphor from physics, which is really about this kind of recurring pattern across different levels of analysis that tends to be quasi-homologous, quasi-similar across different levels. So I want to explore, for example, variation within some countries like the US in terms of tight and loose and across time. And finally, I'm going to ask, which is better? If I was in person, I'd have you vote. If you had to design a world, which would you choose to live in, tight or loose, and why? And I'm going to then talk about tight and loose and its implications during COVID-19. So that's the agenda. At the end of the talk, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments and tell you where you can find the quiz to see where you lean on the tight-loose mindset continuum. So let me just start with what we learned at the most national level of analysis. This is a study that we did that was published in the journal Science some years ago. And the goal of this study was to try to map countries around the world in terms of variation on tight and loose. We had surveys that we were deploying around the world. We were also collecting data on ecological conditions, historical conditions of countries. And also we were sending research assistants out into city streets to observe behavior. And I want to tell you a little about some of this at a high level, and all of this work is on my website, so you can read more about it if you're interested. And what we found in this study was that we could place countries on a continuum in terms of tight and loose. And even though all nations have tight and loose elements, still some countries veer tighter. In our samples, these included places like Singapore and Japan and China and Austria and Germany. On the flip side, we saw other countries that leaned looser, including places like New Zealand, Brazil, Greece, the Netherlands, and the US to some extent. And we found that people agreed on their perceptions of this construct, and that this construct was different than other kinds of distinctions that we can look at the national level. For example, tight loose was independent of things like national wealth. You could have tight cultures that were poor and that were rich, and likewise loose cultures that were poor and were rich. And what we noticed about this distinction was a really interesting trade-off that I'm going to show you the data, what we found. And this trade-off can be really constitutes what I call an order versus openness distinction across cultures. And what we found was that tight cultures had a lot of order. They had, for example, much lower crime and much higher degrees of monitoring in terms of police per capita, in terms of security cameras per capita. There's a really interesting story. Some of you may watch NPR, listen to NPR, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me on Sunday mornings. And there was a great segment where Peter Sagal was talking about what Japanese police officers need more of. And people were guessing they need higher pay, they need more vacation time. But actually, it turns out they need more crime, because Japan has such a low level of crime that they found that some police officers were trying to egg people on to commit minor crimes because they were so bored in some contexts. Tight cultures in our data also had a lot more uniformity in terms of what people wear, what cars they drive. Even the clocks in city streets tend to have more uniformity in tight cultures. I looked at how, for example, synchronized clocks were in city streets. In tight cultures, they were off by milliseconds. In looser cultures, including places like Greece and Brazil, the clocks really said very different types of times. You weren't always entirely sure what time it was. And finally, tight cultures also have a lot of self-control. In contexts where there's a lot more strict punishments for deviance, people develop impulse control from a very early age. And that has its correlates in terms of things like lower debt in tight cultures, lower obesity, lower alcoholism and drug abuse. Even when I was doing research for this book, I found that pets tend to be skinnier in tight cultures. My own beloved Portuguese water dog is kind of obese. And so tight cultures really corner the market on order. And loose cultures struggle with order. They have higher crime, they have less uniformity, and they have a host of self-regulation failures. But loose cultures corner the market on openness. In our data, they have much more tolerance in terms of their willingness to cross lines across race and with immigrants, with people who are disabled. In some studies that we did, when we sent our RAs around the world, we had them wearing, in some conditions, some tattoos and nose rings. In other conditions, we had them wearing fake facial warts that I bought them on the internet. And in another condition, they were wearing just their normal face. And we asked them to ask for help on city streets and for help in city stores. And what we found was really interesting. Across all cultures, when people were just wearing their normal face, they didn't vary in terms of how much help they got. But in the conditions where they were wearing these stigmatized identities, they got far less help in tight cultures and far more help in loose cultures. Loose cultures also corner the market in openness in terms of creativity. In large crowdsourcing contests of creativity, people from loose cultures are more likely to enter those contests and they're more likely to win. And finally, loose cultures also are more tolerant of change. And that's also something that speaks to that kind of adaptability. And so you can see loose cultures corner the market on openness, whereas tight cultures tend to struggle with openness. Now, one question we really had here was, well, what really might be predicting tight loose? Why did these differences evolve in the first place? As I mentioned, there's no effective GDP. There's also no common language or religion or geographic location that unites tight cultures on the one hand and loose cultures on the other. But what I was expecting, what I was theorizing with this study, and this was also driving how we selected the countries because we wanted variability on certain types of predictors, what we're really putting our money on was the idea that maybe one factor that differentiates tight and loose cultures is the amount of collective threat that nations have experienced over the course of their histories. By threat, I mean threat from Mother Nature, think chronic natural disasters, famine, could be also invasions on one's own territory, population density and pathogens or other types of threats that might cause the evolution of tightness. And there's a pretty simple reason why this might be the case. When you have a lot of chronic threat, constant threat, you need more rules and punishments in order to survive, to coordinate, to survive. These are kind of contexts where there's tremendous amount of chaos, where there's the risk of defection and even more chaos. And so rules help people coordinate in these contexts. They're the glue that help people to survive those kinds of contexts. So in this paper, we showed some proof of concept of this. We measured things like population density as far back as 1500. We measured pathogen outbreaks and natural disasters. We measured how often in the last 100 years nations have been potentially invaded by their neighbors. We also measured things like how much conflict a nation has been involved in, not on their own soil. We didn't expect that that would actually predict tightness. We expected it's really when you have to coordinate when you're being attacked on your own soil. And that's exactly what we found in this study. We found, for example, collective threats like population density, deprivation, disasters, territorial conflict, and pathogen prevalence all were correlated with our scores on tightness. As these threats were increasing, so was tightness on the y-axis. Now, that's not the only predictor of tightness, and not all tight cultures have threat, and not all loose cultures don't, but there tends to be a pretty robust association in this data and in other data that we've collected. Other types of predictors really relate to also the agricultural subsistence level that nations have. For example, this graph is looking at how much nations have historically been focused on rice farming as compared to wheat farming. Rice farming is actually very high on the need for coordination because it's very difficult to cultivate. And so these kinds of contexts have developed stricter rules and punishments in order to be able to coordinate for this livelihood, this subsistence livelihoods. And so these are just some examples of the predictors of tightness. I can talk later about some others, but I wanted to mention this is not just something that exists in the modern era. We can look back into pre-industrial societies and we can see similar patterns. Here's where we turn to ethnographies, these long texts that anthropologists have collected over the decades. And we can code lots of different domains of life in these ethnographies, including things like law and order, gender, sexuality, marriage, funerals, and so forth for how strict their rules are and punishments. And that's exactly what we did in this study. We found that these domains tended to highly correlate with each other, so we can have an overall score on tightness, looseness. And we found across many different areas, this is all around the world, very similar types of predictors of our scores across 86 small scale societies in terms of those kinds of threats I was telling you about. That includes population density, warfare, pathogens, and scarcity. I want to say that this is also something that we can zoom into some countries that have a lot of variability and look at this as a fractal pattern and see whether or not we can explore whether there's pockets of tightness in different countries and that are also predicted by similar things and have similar consequences in terms of the order and openness trade-off. And that's what we've been doing more recently. We now can rank order the 50 states in terms of their tightness, looseness. States like in the South and the Midwest tend to veer tighter, and coasts tend to veer looser with some exceptions. But you can see this is a paper that we also published a couple of years ago, where we then tracked in terms of what predicts that variability in things like natural disasters and scarcity, pathogens, and how much areas were rural, where there's a lot of gossip and a lot of monitoring. All of these were correlated with state level tightness. As well, we can see that the tight, loose order and openness trade-off also seems to apply to the state level in the US. For example, we found in this study that tight states tend to have a lot of order. They have people who are more conscientious and rule-oriented. They have more social organization in terms of more law enforcement, less homelessness, less divorce. And they have higher self-control, less drug use, recreational drug use, and less debt, controlling for various factors. Loose states, like loose nations, tend to have more openness. They have people who score higher on personality measures of openness. They tend to have more creativity, more patents and foreign artists per capita. And they also tend to have more equality, fewer EEOC claims of discrimination, and more minority-owned businesses controlling for a number of minorities in the context. And again, you can zoom into any state also and find in tight states some loose pockets, and in loose states some tight pockets. But we see that the logic of tight loose tends to follow in the United States. Also, other studies that have been now mapping tight loose within the context of, for example, China, have found in looking at variation in China that there's a similar logic across the 30+ provinces in China. I want to talk about one more level of analysis, which I think has really been interesting for us to explore before I get to this question of which is better, tight or loose. And that is social class. When we ask people around the world, and we ask them questions like, what do you think of when we say follow the rules? And I can ask you right now, what comes up in your mind when I say follow the rules? What we find is people answer this question very differently depending on what social class they come from. What we see is that the working class, which has a lot of threat, many, many different threats that they're exposed to, worried about falling into poverty or what sociologists call hard living, live in more dangerous neighborhoods, and also are embedded in more dangerous occupations, they tend to answer this question very differently than people from the upper classes. They think that meaning of rules are more positive. They'll say things like, following the rules is good. It gives me structure. It keeps me safe. People from the upper class tend to have more negative things they say about following the rules. If you look at any bookstore in the United States and you look at mainstream books, many of them talk about breaking the rules. Even I could find some children's books that talk about how to create anarchy. People think that rules are for kind of goody two-shoes and they're really a nuisance. And we can see that this is really helping to explain some class variation. In our scales, when we ask people about their desired tightness, working class also says that they like higher tightness, and they also report having more tightness in their daily life, in their childhoods, in their workplace. In these studies, we also can see that it's linked to threat. When we ask people for their zip codes in the US, we can then see that actually people who report more tightness are living in more threatening environments, and they also tend to report more threat. One of our most recent studies where we get really into very young samples is when we actually recruit some kids into our lab. These are 3-year-olds, and you can't exactly ask 3-year-olds what they think about rules. But what we do is we take this ingenious paradigm developed in developmental psychology, where we bring children in the lab and we have them playing with a puppet. This is Max the puppet on the left, and they're playing some new games and learning the rules of the game. And all of a sudden in the middle experiment, Max does something kind of weird. He starts breaking the rules and he's saying, oh, I'm playing this correctly. And we simply videotape these kids to see what they do. Do they protest against Max? Do they laugh at Max? And sure enough, our data suggests that working class kids actually protest more and tell Max to stop, whereas upper class kids are more likely to laugh at Max and let him off the hook. And we know from surveying the parents of young children from the working class and the upper class that they also report that rules are important for keeping kids out of trouble. So let me just now turn to this question of which is better, tight or loose. This has obviously been a question that we've been asking for many, many years across different disciplines. It's an age-old debate in political philosophy and economics and sociology and psychology. And so, for example, we can ask ourselves, which is better, freedom or rules, constraint? Plato, Confucius, and certainly Hobbes would have voted for tightness. Hobbes thought we were kind of, really brutal and would have voted for tightness. Other people like John Stuart Mill or Freud thought rules made us neurotic and would vote for looseness. And the question really is, well, what's correct? What does the data suggest? And we started to thinking about this question and we thought, well, maybe it's neither. Maybe groups need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, like I mentioned, but maybe as groups get too extreme, too extremely loose or too extremely tight, that they start to become really dysfunctional. Some people, such as Eric Fromm and Durkheim and Etzioni, started talking about this, and I wanted to go out and test this idea. This is what I would call the Goldilocks principle of tight-loose, and it predicts what was called an inverted U or curvilinear relationship between tight-loose and societal well-being. And the idea is that when you get really extremely tight, it becomes so untenable because it's so much repression and people want to escape that context. But on the flip side, extreme looseness, where there's very few rules, where people are really not coordinated in any way, what Durkheim called anomie, is also untenable, where people want to escape from this context. And that's exactly what we found in a study we published. This graph is looking at how tight-loose affects or is related to depression and suicide and blood pressure and happiness. And what you can see here is that the extremes of tight and loose on this x-axis relate to higher levels of depression, higher levels of suicide, higher blood pressure, and lower happiness. I will say this principle of tight-loose and the curvilinear relationship really applies to many different settings. And I want to just give you a couple of examples. I think this balance of freedom and constraint is something that we're constantly trying to deal with. For example, when we're making decisions, and we know from the literature and psychology that when we have too little choice, we have really this kind of negative effect and decreased sense of autonomy. But if we have too much choice, too much latitude, we really feel a sense of paralysis and choice overload. And this also undermines our satisfaction. Also, in the leadership literature, we know that leaders that provide too little discretion, who are too authoritarian and too directive, as well as leaders that are give too much discretion or laissez-faire, kind of absent and distant, both of these extremes produce low acceptance and low satisfaction among followers. Also, innovation is another example where we know that we need both tight and loose. We need looseness to be creative, but we need tightness to implement this and coordinate to scale up. So really, loose groups can be really creative, but not really implement those kinds of ideas to a great extent. Very tight groups can be great at implementation, but maybe not so much at creativity. And I'll just give you one more example, which is parenting. We know from the literature, again, that the extremes of tight and loose are also problematic. Overly strict parents produce kids that lack self-discipline and self-confidence, that might even have failures to restrain from antisocial behavior when they're not being monitored. On the flip side, overly lax and laissez-faire parents also produce problematic kids who engage in risk-taking behaviors and other problematic things like drinking and substance abuse. So really what this suggests to us, and I said also, I should say one more example, is that also we know that we need to balance freedom and constraint in organizations. Certainly some organizations need to lean tight if they're in highly threatened and high coordination needing context, like airlines and manufacturing. But we know that organizations that get too tight, that become very helicopter-like and ultra standardized, have rules for everything, they have people walking on eggshells. Likewise, on the flip side, we know some organizations need to veer loose or can veer loose. There might be in the creative business, but if they get too loose, they start getting more chaotic. They have very little oversight. They tend to be unpredictable and chaotic, where people are missing deadlines. These are equally problematic. And we could see this actually when we look at reviews on Glassdoor, which is a large it's a large database where people rate organizations, we can see that people can tap into this kind of extreme tight and loose. In ultra loose organizations, people talk about them being too disorganized and decentralized, and where there's extreme chaos and everything's irregular and unpredictable. On the flip side, we see people talking about tight organizations being very hierarchical and rigid, bureaucratic, even to the point where people are telling you when you can use the restroom. These all suggest that actually we need to think about how to balance tight and loose in our everyday environments, whether it's in our households or organizations and our nations. And it suggests that we need to harness the power of social norms and pivot when we need to make changes. We need to identify contexts where we need to loosen tight norms, and we might need to identify contexts where we need to tighten loose norms. This is what I call tight-loose ambidexterity. And it's a really exciting idea because what it suggests is that culture is not destiny. We can, if we recognize this cultural code, we can make pivots when we need to for healthier social systems. And I want to just give you one example before I get into the final part of my talk, which is on COVID-19, which is clearly a time where we needed to pivot. But let me just give you an example in organizational contexts. In contexts where we might need to loosen up tight cultures, we call this flexible tightness. These kinds of contexts, like the military or airlines or hospitals, need to veer tight. They have a lot of safety needs and they have a lot of coordination needs. But we might need to incorporate some discretion, insert some discretion into those systems in non-safety domains. On the flip side, some loose cultures that are getting too loose, we need to tighten up by providing some more structure, inserting some structure into a loose system. I would nominate some places in the Silicon Valley where I am that might need to do this. Clearly, the social media, which is a wild, wild west of normlessness, also is a context that I've been working on more recently in my research in terms of how to figure out how do we have a healthy balance of tight and loose online. In other words, how do we have a context where we have both empowerment and freedom, but also have felt accountability? So this is the real exciting challenge that we have. And as I mentioned, it's exciting because we developed social norms and we certainly can harness the power of them to create this kind of balance. So I'll just mention some things that we can do in organizational context or in households, for example. If we're trying to create flexible tightness, we want to insert some discretion into tight cultural systems. We call this the ease model. And this is just some examples. Really, these contexts, we need to start thinking about how do we loosen up by giving more discretion when rules are not really necessary, allowing more exploration and unstructured time, shifting to more decentralized structure, and even encouraging people to speak up more and to have more pushback. This can help us to create a more balanced system where we have more discretion and flexibility in a tight system. On the flip side, when we want to try to engage in more structured looseness, these are contexts that need to have a little bit more tightness inserted into their loose system. We call this the secure model. Here we're trying to activate more felt accountability, where we're setting more benchmarks, establishing structure, centralizing and monitoring people, making sure people know that they're being held to accountability where rules will be enforced. And I can talk more about this because this is the kind of work that I'm doing now with a lot of organizations on either of these two quests. I want to end by talking about COVID. And basically, this was something that, it's been a terrible situation for all of us. And I actually started thinking about this in Breckenridge 2 years ago. I was skiing right when COVID hit. Now I'm a big convert to Vail. But I wrote an op-ed at the time, which appeared in the Boston Globe, and started to think about, we really need to remember that this is a global pandemic. It's not just about medicine. It's also about culture. And it's a time where we need to temporarily tighten because this is something that's evolutionarily adaptive to tighten during times of threat, to help us coordinate and actually to help us defeat the threat. And actually, we have many examples in our history where we have tightened under threat, but the coronavirus is very different. It's an invisible germ that's easy to ignore and easy to distort. And I started to study this with my computer science team and started developing computational models because my hunch was that it might be that looser cultures that have not had so much chronic threat in their histories might take longer to tighten. And that's exactly what we started showing. We showed in these models that actually what you could see here is over time, how much are people cooperating and following the rules? And tight cultures start much earlier to tighten rules, and they, as a result, they tend to have higher survival rates. These are just computational models. So, this is something that we have to take with a grain of salt, but it was our first sort of test of, it might be that this kind of evolutionary mismatch between looseness and threat. And I want to just introduce this term. I think it's really interesting literature coming from biology. And this literature is about the idea that traits that evolved in one environment could be highly disadvantageous in a different environment. And so looseness is really a great trait for innovation and for openness. But the question is, during a rapid threat that comes, can we shift quickly enough in order to deal with that threat? And there's a lot of examples of when environmental changes happen very rapidly, that because evolution is a gradual process, that we might have these kinds of mismatches. They've been applied to things like obesity and drug addiction, gambling. They've been applied to non-human types of context in terms of traits that were not well matched to new threats. So this was really what we started to look at. Is there a liability of looseness during collective threat? So our models told us that there might be, but then we started looking at cases and deaths per capita by the end of 2020. And this is published in the Lancet Planetary Health. What you see here is the study of 57 countries. We added data since the original science paper. This is scores right before COVID hit on tight loose. And what you see here is that there's a pretty robust relationship between the strictness of social norms and lower cases per capita. This, of course, is just a correlation. We want to try to get rid of this effect by controlling for lots of different things. This is some crazy table, but I'll just tell you that we control for lots of things. We control for testing and GDP and inequality and density and government efficiency and other dimensions of culture and authoritarianism and everything, lots of things you can think of. But our effects were still robust for these factors. So culture matters for COVID. It also mattered for deaths per capita. You can see this here. It's a little bit stronger of an effect. And again, this is something that's robust to many different controls. What was really astonishing from my point of view is another piece of data we published in this paper, which was looking at how fearful people were about COVID. This is a smaller sample size. It's representative samples published by YouGov in the UK, where over time, from March 2020 until the late fall of 2020, they were asking people across 20 some countries how much they were very or somewhat scared that they will contract COVID. And what we found was really unbelievable. That we found tight cultures from the first 100 days, but even until we were collecting the data in the late fall, consistently had more fear. And loose cultures had far less fear. So you could see here that about 70% of people really thought that there was this very scary COVID in tight cultures, whereas it was only about 50% in loose cultures. And so that's really astonishing because tight cultures were doing much better in terms of cases and deaths, but still maintained fear. Now, of course, not all loose cultures did poorly and not all tight cultures did well during COVID. For example, New Zealand is a country that really was ambidextrous. They were able to, with good governance and with people who were willing to abide by the rules and call out people who were not following the rules, they were able to really get a good handle on COVID. And again, this is multiply determined, but it does suggest that we can shift if we need to, if we have the right willpower and the right leadership. So I want to just mention some of the lessons that we learned from COVID-19, and I'll be ending in just a minute so we can open up for questions. I mean, one I think is that we need to have clear and consistent messaging. In particular, in a case where we have a pandemic, we need to make the threat very concrete, because as I mentioned, this is an abstract germ that's easier to ignore. And we need to remember that tightening is temporary. In contexts where looseness has been evolving, because there's been less threat, people feel very threatened by tightening, but we need to convince people that it's actually temporary. And in fact, tightening helps to reduce the threat. And that's what we see in our data. And that is to say, the faster we tighten, the faster we reduce the threat, and the faster we can have freedom. And of course, most importantly, is we have to remember that we are in this together, that nations that really had a high collective identity did much better during COVID. So I will say that there's lots more to talk about. I only have about 40 minutes, But I do want to mention that, you can see kind of where you veer on the tight loose mindset on my website. I like to affectionately use this metaphor of what kind of Muppet you are, coming from Slate. Dahlia Litwick introduced this, and you can think about, are you more like Kermit the Frog or Ernie, that like a lot of rules and like structure and like to avoid making mistakes, or are you more like Ernie or Cookie Monster, that don't notice the rules so much and are tolerant of ambiguity, but might be a little bit impulsive? And you can take this quiz on my website, and it's something that will give you a sense of whether you veer tight or loose, and it's an interesting exercise to think about why you might veer tight or loose and how this might be affecting your everyday life, your fit with your organizations, your conflict with your partners or your kids or your colleagues. And to think about really to start thinking about how to negotiate these kind of conflicts. I will say that, truth be told, I veer moderately loose. My spouse, who is an attorney, veers moderately tight. And one of our most hilarious conflicts has to do with how I load the dishwasher, which he's horrified how I load the dishwasher. But this is the kind of thing where you can start, like I mentioned, if we start thinking about these as visible codes, we can talk about them and we can negotiate them for happier lives. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing, and I will open it up to Claire to help moderate discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gelfand. We do have a lot of questions, but I will tell you, I did go to your website and I did take your quiz, and I'm definitely a Bert, which is no surprise to me or to anybody who knows me. Now, I know you mentioned religion at one point, but Travis has a question about, for example, Buddhism. So he says it was unfunded and effectively banished from India during a time of conflict. So he's speculating that perhaps higher order religious practices that are less tight, moralistic, or dogmatic don't thrive well in a stressed environment.
Well, that is really, it's a really interesting question. We haven't studied that. I've become a Jewish Buddhist myself, so I'm really in love with Buddhism. I think every religion has both tight and loose elements, so you can find more strict aspects of many different religions, or looser aspects of the religion. One thing that we have been studying that is really quite interesting to me, we published a few papers on this last year, I can send them to you, Travis, is we looked at when you feel a lot of threats, a lot of conflict, whether it's from Mother Nature or human nature, do you perceive God to be more punishing or more loving? And actually, the Bible and other texts, have a lot of variability in how God is portrayed in terms of how punishing and or loving God is. And what we can see across many, many, many years is that during times of conflict or threat, people perceive God to be more punishing. And that's both in Bible passages, we've tracked them over time, and it's also in experiments when we actually activate threat. So you can think about actually that even within religions, we can kind of think about that during times of threat, people want a more punishing God because it provides that kind of security that people will behave themselves more during these contexts. So there's a lot of interesting questions around religion and tight loose, and that's just one of them. But I'd be happy to talk offline about other types of projects we can work on that.
So looking at the countries that you gave as an example of tight versus loose, one of the things that struck me, and it could have just been that sample, was that tighter countries seem to be more homogenous, and looser countries tend to have more heterogeneity in terms of race and ethnicity. Is that a correlation that you saw, or is that just accidental of the countries that you?
It's a great question. I mean, it tends to be also kind of non-linear, because there are a lot of countries that are tight are homogeneous, but there are countries like India and Pakistan that are quite tight, but that are very heterogeneous in terms of language and ethnicity and so forth. So there tends to be a correlation, but there's also a lot of exceptions on that. And so it tends to be curvilinear, actually, in our research.
So John's question relates to COVID. And he said, in the COVID environment, the data seemed to be flipped regarding looseness and tightness on a state-by-state basis, because you said the Midwest and Southern states and more rural areas were tight. But in COVID, these seem to be the areas most resistant to COVID rules. What's going on there?
It's astonishing. And it's really interesting. Ezra Klein had a really interesting article that he wrote and interviewed a bunch of us and social scientists about, for many, many years, conservative states, tight states have reported more threat sensitivity, both even in the brain in neuroscience work. So this was really a very huge flip during this particular threat. And I would say that, this is another evolutionary mismatch. And I think that we know tight groups, whether they're states or their countries, tend to put great faith in their leaders. They desire more kind of independent leaders. We have a lot of research on this in organizations around like 62 countries that we published. And looser groups tend to like more collaborative leadership, more visionary leadership, which makes a lot of sense also. And I think what we have here was an evolutionary mismatch. We have tight states who are following, basically a leader who did not take it so seriously early on. And so I think it provided that kind of interfered with the signal, the threat signal that naturally causes tightening. So I think we can think about evolutionary mismatches in terms of how the threat signal can be basically disturbed or distorted or hijacked. I want to also mention that the flip side could be the case. Another evolutionary mismatch that I'm writing about is context where there's actually little threat, but there's the threats being hyped up and being manipulated and causing groups to tighten unnecessarily. So there's two different types of mismatches. One is when there's real threat and groups are not tightening because the threat signal has been interfered with or manipulated or ignored, repressed. The other flip side is when threat is not real, but groups are getting the wrong signal that there's threat and it's causing unnecessary tightening. And actually it's a problem because it's also associatively causing people to be less open. So I think really a key here for us, the lesson that we learn is that we really need to be calibrated about the actual level of threat that we have, because we can have both of these kinds of mismatches. I want to mention, I have a paper coming out next week and the Proceedings of the National Academy, which presents a new threat dictionary where we developed a computational linguistic tool to diagnose threat in any kind of social media, newspapers, and track. You could see, we created a threat barometer. It's on my website where you can actually see how much threatening language are you being exposed to in your daily feed and newspapers, because then we want to see what kind of impact can that have on groups. And we track the impact of threatening language across the last 100 years in US history. I didn't have enough time to talk about this, but there's a shameless plug for this new paper that we have. But John, I hope that answered your question, because I think it is, it just speaks to the fact that even tight groups can get the wrong signal and they can follow the wrong norm.
Next question comes from Bob, and he's wondering if you have any examples of countries that have changed from loose to tight or tight back to loose.
Yeah, this is a great question, Bob. And I talk about it in the book. I talk about an example of Iceland that really had a great experiment when it came to tight loose change. Some years ago, Iceland was suffering from a lot of delinquency, like chaotic cities and just kids who were just drunk and high all the time, basically. And really what they did was a massive intervention. It was a tightness intervention where they got parents together and people together to say, how can we get more accountability on city streets? How can we together help shift kids into like different behaviors and have them really be rewarded for them? And it was an exercise in shifting to a tighter kind of context that produced, really a role model for the rest of Europe trying to deal with a lot of this drug abuse. So we do see lots of examples of this. We see even this examples in organizations after United Airlines, had that kind of really big PR fiasco a couple of years ago. There was a lot of question around, are they too tight? Now they're an airline, they need to be tight. We don't want them making all sorts of weird decisions, want them loosening up on an airline. But you saw, that they started to think about how can we give people empowerment in non-safety related domains? How can we have customer service agents being given more flexibility, more latitude? And I think it was an exercise in loosening that tight system. I'm working now also with the US Navy. I'm doing research with the Navy, and it's another good example of a context where, they need to be tight, but they also want to have more innovation and they want to be looser and more flexible. So there's a real question of how can leaders be both tight and loose and ambidextrous? And it's a really exciting set of research questions that we're looking at with them. I think what's interesting about it is that it can change. We can develop ways to be more ambidextrous and really have that empowerment, but also that accountability.
Next question comes from Pete. And he says he acknowledges that Germany is an obviously tight culture, but they did a remarkable job of allowing Syrian immigrants in and integrating them. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, this is a great question, Pete. And I think this is still an experiment in progress, because, this was really dictated by Merkel and really trying to kind of help people accept that this is a duty to the world and so forth. But, it's had a lot of also negative consequences in Germany. There's been a lot of, rise of neo-Nazi groups. There's been a lot of extremism. And a lot of it is because, of this kind of feeling that these immigrants are threatening, and it's causing that kind of tightening of certain groups. And, I think one of the things that we're trying to do in some research in Germany and in other places is to try to help each other understand, we all live in these echo chambers, and we don't quite understand actually that we're more similar to each other than we would ever imagine that we actually would think that we are. So, we're doing studies where we try to give people daily diaries of people from other groups. We did this actually with Americans reading Pakistani diaries, and we had Pakistanis reading American diaries. Because who doesn't want to read someone's diary? You kind of feel like you're getting a little voyeuristic. And what we found was really, really fascinating. After we had them reading each other's diaries, compared to just reading a diary from their own cultural group, they saw so much more similarity. They still saw each other as different, but they saw that, wow, we really have a lot more commonality. And we're going to be doing this with immigrants and natives in Germany and other contexts to see whether this daily diary technique can also help reduce cultural conflict between people who are living in their echo chambers. We also have a study going on where we're doing this with Democrats and Republicans in the United States. I'll report back, invite me back again, and I'll report back and what goes on with that. So in any event, I think it is a really interesting question, and we have to help people not see immigrants as threats, that causes that kind of tightening.
So since Pete has opened this door to Germany, I'm going to stick with Germany for just a question that has always baffled me. So there's a thing in Germany called Freie Körperkultur, which is this embracing of public nudity. And it actually started in Eastern Germany. Yeah. And it's nuts because, you think of Germany as this very tight culture, but then you go to like a public lake and there's people walking around nude, or you go to a hotel and out on the deck, there's people sunbathing nude. What is that? Yeah. What do you make of that?
I think it's really a fascinating question. And I do want to say that what's so interesting is to look at the kind of loose pockets in tight cultures, or loose domains that evolve in tight cultures, and also the tight domains that evolve in loose cultures. Because as I mentioned with that research on this curvilinear effect, we need to have that kind of balance. Nations that are healthy they might veer tight, but they have to have some sort of release valve, like you see in Germany in that context. Japan is another example. There are legislated areas of looseness in Japan, even though it leans tight. So there are contexts in Tokyo, even like actual areas where people just let loose. Let loose with your boss. There's another kind of legislative looseness. Even karaoke is kind of a legislated, it's kind of a tight way to be loose. That's what my colleagues say. It's kind of structured, but it allows you to let steam off. On the flip side, in loose cultures, there are tight contexts too, tight domains. I would say that any domain that is really important, any value that's really important, evolves to be tight. And so freedom and liberty is very tight in the United States. Privacy is very tight. We don't just show up each other's doors and say, hey, can I have, some food and a drink? We really kind of legislate that domain to be pretty tight. And just another example of that in New Zealand, it's fascinating. A domain, even though it's quite loose, that domain that's pretty tight in New Zealand is egalitarianism. They have a context, it's called tall poppy syndrome. People are not supposed to stand out and they get shot down. And actually it was very helpful for COVID, because my colleagues there say, look, once we decided we have to be tight, everyone's got to be tight. Just because you're rich or you're famous, you got to still be tight. And from what I heard, their phone lines were off the hook with people reporting people not following the rules. And that's tall poppy. That's the advantage of that tight domain. So I would say that it's exciting to kind of think about and help people understand when they're going abroad what they might be experiencing in terms of the general level of tightness, but then where they might find the opposite code. And what's interesting, is a lot of expatriates who go abroad, who are trained to go abroad in the United States and in other places, we select people because of their technical competence, because they're really good at their job, but actually what we need to do is make them culturally intelligent. And that's a term that comes from my field as measures of cultural intelligence. We can cultivate CQ, as we call it. And in my research, it makes a really important difference in terms of people's negotiation effectiveness above and beyond IQ or EQ or any Q. So in any event, that's a kind of long answer to your question, Claire, but I think it's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, you mentioned working with the United States Navy. Our next question comes from Judy, and she asks, in the US, what other organizations are using your modeling of tightness and looseness?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm now working, as I mentioned, with a bunch of social media platforms, that are concerned about levels of incivility, on their platforms. And this isn't a question of looseness. This is a question of how do you nudge people to be more accountable online without sacrificing the kind of freedom that we want from our online environments. I think that's going to be one of the most important questions that we have to solve as humans in the next decade and more. We've evolved to really be able to manage norms in so many ways over the course of our history. So I believe it's going to happen, and it will happen bottom up, like you see in Reddit. We start seeing people developing monitors and accountability. And it also needs to come from the top down as well. We need to think about, we're living in these online worlds now, and we need to think about how to create ways that people feel empowered, but also accountable. So that's, I think, that's another set of organizations that I work with beyond just the military. But there's also the other places that I work with quite a bit are hospitals that are also trying to, clearly be tight as they should be. A lot of safety issues, a lot of accountability, but also need to have some flexibility and have looseness for innovation. And so that's another context that I think is really important. And I'm working with some hospitals on that, this topic also.
So you've mentioned in the program parenting a couple of times, for instance, reference to Iceland. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote a book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And I also think it's interesting from your perspective as a professor. They talk about the culture of safetyism, and they say it's changing an entire generation and not for the good. Are you seeing this? Is this a big cultural shift? And do you see it as tight or loose?
I think it's a fascinating question. One thing I would add to their analysis is that there's a reason why there's this increasing coddling of kids and this kind of protectionism. And it's because parents are feeling so much more threat in this world. I think that there's this tremendous amount of change. It's the rate of change, as Thomas Friedman, my friend, would say, is just astronomical. The amount of choice that we have compared to like the 1970s. I grew up in New York. There were a couple of different restaurant types that we had. Like now, the amount of latitude in so many ways has gotten exponential, and that feels very threatening. Even the admission to colleges. I have two kids who are teenagers, one who's a junior in college now. The college admission process it's not even comparable to when I was growing up. It's so much more competitive. That's a threat to many parents. And so in a typical tight, loose evolution sense, I would say that it's producing more of that helicopter-like parenting style. Now, I think it's important to recognize that it's happening. I would argue it's happening for that reason, that people are feeling a lot more unpredictability and threat. I think there's ways to negotiate this in the household. I'm also really interested in developing more techniques for that. It might be a subject of a next book for me, where we can help people negotiate with their spouses, with their kids, how to have tight, loose balance in the household. So for example, we have new scales where you can look at, okay, how strict or permissive are parents when it comes to, their kids' appearance or their healthy, the kind of food they eat, or their curfew, their technology use, their performance in their schools. And we can talk about our kids, which domains should be tight and which could be loose. And that's a negotiation we all should have with our spouse. And it's going to be different for different social classes, for different people. But, just like any good negotiation, we need to prioritize, like, what domain is really important to me for tightness or looseness. And we do that in my household, for better or worse. My poor kids, these kids have had to listen to tight, loose stuff for a long time. But I think it's very important in terms of their book and this kind of increasing trend is to think about how to have more balance in households.
So we're really just about out of time. I have one last question for you. In your book, you talk about the social custom of shaking hands. And apparently we have the ancient Greeks to thank for shaking hands. But I think a lot of people thought during the pandemic that handshaking would finally die and we'd replace it with the elbow bump or the fist bump. But it looks like it's making a comeback. It seems pretty intractable. Do you see handshakes staying with us for the foreseeable millennia?
It's interesting. I mean, they really don't really serve a function really anymore. They used to serve the function of making sure that someone wasn't carrying a weapon. But we know that, shaking hands is a very communal type of act. It actually predicts higher negotiation agreements, more creative negotiation agreements when people shake hands. It's something we're so used to. My sense is that as the threat subsides, we hope, that kind of behavior, that loosening of this new norm that we have is going to happen. I, for one, have a high-fiving problem. My students have told me I have a high-fiving problem for many years. And so I turned to the high elbow for some time, but I do kind of make that prediction that, we will hopefully go back to a little bit of normalcy once the threat subsides.
Dr. Gelfand, this has been a fascinating hour. Thank you for spending it with us. And thanks to everybody at home who tuned in this evening to watch tonight's program. I hope you'll join us on Tuesday for another fascinating program on the changing demographics of the world and what the ramifications of that will be. Thank you, Dr. Gelfand. Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much.
Good night.